Hello, my name is Osagi Obasagi, and I'm a professor in the School of Public Health and the Joint Medical Program here at the University of California, Berkeley. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first panel conversation on the various video series, Race, the Power of Illusion, Part 1, The Differences Between Us. So we'll be hosting two more screenings and panel discussions of Part 2 and Part 3 on September 25th and October 9th. I'd like to thank the sponsors for this wonderful program, the Othering and Belonging Institute, and the Berkeley School of Public Health, and the Center for Research and Social Change. So this documentary first aired in 2003 as a way to introduce people to the history of scientific racism and how developments in DNA technologies were upending lay and traditional understandings of race. This was a moment in time that shortly followed the announcement of the completion of the Human Genome Project, which mapped all the genes that make up humanity. This project was understood as showing in a definitive manner what social scientists have known for decades, that there is no biological basis for race. Race is a crude social and political category that does not map onto human genetic variation or population differences. At this time, many people expected race as an idea to dissipate and go away given this new knowledge. For those of us who study race, we knew that this hope was a bit overly optimistic, even and perhaps especially for scientists who see their work as being driven by data and evidence. Race is about ideological and political commitments rather than any known facts. And sure enough, shortly after this announcement, we began to see new articulations concerning the biological significance of race that are just as troublesome as old ones. During this panel, we will revisit episode 1 of this documentary and try to understand its importance and limitations in light of various developments over the past 17 years. So today I'm joined by an extraordinary group of experts who will focus on this issue. So first we have Darlene Francis, who's an associate professor in the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. We have Evelyn Hammonds, who is at Harvard University and is the chair of the Department of History of Science, as well as the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science and a professor of African and African American Studies. We also have Leslie Lusko, who's a professor in integrative biology at the University of California, Berkeley. And lastly, we have John A. Powell, who is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is also the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion, and also a professor of law and a professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies. So our first question for this panel will go to Professor Lusko. So a lot of science has happened since the documentary has aired. What would you say has been the biggest scientific advancement in our understanding of race?
Well, you started out, you made reference to the Human Genome Project, and we started with, one human genome costing, billions of dollars to sequence, to today, where you can sequence a genome for less than $1,000, and the ability to sequence that many genomes for, very little money means that we now have full genomes, not just mitochondrial DNA sequences like they were talking about in that documentary. But now we have full genomes, 3 billion base pairs for thousands of individuals. And what this has really done is to tell us a lot more about what the structure of that genetic variation is. So the students had talked about, and the scientists had made reference to human variation, kind of that we need to be thinking about more that we're mutts. And mutts, is kind of a confusing term to use. It doesn't really make sense because we can still see that people look different depending on what major geographic region you might be from. But what we've been able to find through this genomic variation at this large scale sampling is that actually we all have 4 to 6 different populations represented within our genomes. And so we have variation between people, but that you actually aren't just one lineage, you're actually a mix of different populations. And this helps, I think this helps people understand why you can still see variation between people, and yet between people from different parts of the world, and yet you still have most of that variation within those 5 major sort of quote unquote racial categories that people had created, hundreds of years ago to be thinking about human variation. So the genomic evidence, I think, has really helped to further undermine, but also refine our understanding of human genetic variation.
Mhm. Great, thank you. And this next question is first for Professor Hammond, and then we'll explore it with other folks, other panelists. So, what updates would you make to the science portion of this film?
So I think the science portion of the film, like anybody would say, there've been a lot of advances in genetics and genomics. Leslie had just told us some of them, but at the core of it is still a concern to look at variation within groups and variation between groups, and how those groups are defined is still at the heart of the matter. And in some respects, how the population groups are defined are can be problematic. And for the social scientists like me and Osaji and many of our other scholars, if the ways in which those populations are defined still carry a lineage or a legacy from the old notions of race, then we don't know how far we've come. So, of course, we need to update the science in the story of the film, but I don't think we need to change the experiment itself, because I think one of the virtues of the film and makes it so popular for 17 years, that's amazing, is because it captures young people at the age of, I think these are upper class high school students, 16, 17, who are asking the right questions. They're still the right questions. And so I think we need to update the test that they do and say more about what has happened since then. And we can do that easily, as Leslie also said, because it's much cheaper now to do it. But I don't think it would be right to change to put that experiment in the context of 17, 18-year-old students who are asking the questions, because I think that's one of the powers of the film and has made it so successful over time.
Hmm. Great. And do other panelists have ideas on what updates they might want to make to the science if they were to do this film today?
Well, Sagi, I have one, well, maybe two. So first of all, thank you and all the panelists for being here today and for discussion, and of course the filmmakers for making this, I think, really important film. I think one of the things we've learned a lot, and this has become much more prominent since this film was made, was basically understanding, although largely misunderstanding, the nature of the mind and the unconscious. And one of the things we've learned is, and it's not social scientists, we've been talking about this for years, you don't see the world as it is. We're telling stories about the world, and those stories actually frame how we see the world. And we're meaning making machines, individually and collectively. We're constantly making meanings. We have to make meaning. In part, that's one of the roles of religion, but it goes beyond religion into culture and art and other things as well. And so, in a sense, we're looking for something for a reason.
Yeah.
Looking for, and I think it's important to dig into that more. And I don't think, and I think that's, as I recall, that's not critical in any of the 3 episodes.
Right.
It's like, what are we looking for? It's like, I'm still looking for the unicorn. I'm going to spend my whole life looking for a unicorn. Why? Because it gives me meaning. And in a society that's deeply, deeply racialized and deeply unequal and deeply hierarchical. And now, with white supremacy resurging all the way to the White House, people are trying to, like they did in the 19th century, ground it in pseudoscience. And while, in a sense, science is on the side of both equality and in some ways, I'd say be careful with that. I think that science can't do all the work for us. We have to sort of think about what our motivations are. Why are we so obsessed? And also at a time, not all bad news, that race is much more fluid, and people accept that. Racial and ethnic intermarriage and mixing is much greater. And that challenges these categories themselves. So, and that's going to continue to evolve. And so the issue of contamination in one drop A lot of people don't take that seriously. But then there's still the people, it's like, it's the genocide to the white race. And then the final thing I'll say is that this is a project of white supremacy. It's not just we were confused and now the science is helping us straighten this out. No, what we're actually looking at is trying to refute this project of white supremacy. And I think the project, in a sense, has always been bigger than science, or there have been times when science was an ally. But it's not just a scientific project.
Can I just add one point to that? So, John, you said, the pseudoscience. I really try to get my students not to think about the old racial science as pseudoscience. It was real science. It was science propagated by the leading scientific minds from the 19th century forward. So, and they didn't see it as bad science. They saw it as good science, good scientific questions. And maybe bad methodology, maybe people who made extreme conclusions, but they didn't think it was not science.
Yeah.
Right. No, these were people who were considered quite serious at the time, making serious statements about the world. And so it's important to understand that these were certainly ideas that were taken to heart. John, your comments earlier about your earlier comments about thinking about how I'm trying to remember the exact phrase you used, but understanding this race as a project of white supremacy. There's a conversation I had with my students yesterday in class, and one of the conversations we had was this idea that to think racially about the world is by definition a white supremacist project. That the only way you can think about the world is this way is from a standpoint of hierarchical thinking about race that privileges and prioritizes the interests of whites. And it was interesting watching my students grapple with that, to think about race as not simply some type of objective assessment of the world that is neutral, but rather as emanating from at a particular moment for a particular purpose. And I think that once we are able to have that broader conversation to reorient people, that the very question of race, that is to think about the world in racialized ways, is part of that project. And we'll get to this conversation. One of the last questions I'll ask is back to Professor Hammonds, because she has this wonderful question or statement at the end of the film about unmaking race and racism. And I want to spend some time on that at the end. But I think, part of that is an acknowledgement of kind of the origins of race and racism and what its purpose was as part of that unmaking process. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. I think that's an important conversation to wrap up with. Professor Francis or Lusko, did you have questions or responses to this question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, I just think it's also really important for people who envision the world from a scientific framework to also be thinking about how the scientists that were really establishing and propagating this idea that there are racial differences between groups of people, what they were really doing was looking for differences. And anytime you go looking for differences, you can divide a group of students into two different groups, and you can always find things that will differ between them and biologically. And when you're looking at 3 billion base pairs, you're going to find genetic differences between them. But is it biologically meaningful? And so one of the really important things that we're trying to do in the biological anthropology community and in the people who study human evolution and human variation is to try to reframe this and realizing that the default assumption should always be that you're looking at one population rather than rather than an assumption that you're looking at multiple populations. And that reframing really changes that more racialized perspective. But then the trick is how, if you can adjust this in the way the scientists are working, how do you get that message out to the larger community? Because so much damage has been done in giving people these ideas that racialization is biology. We have to figure out how to undo that in society. And that, as has already been pointed out, that's really the trick.
Great. Professor Francis, did you have comments or?
I have lots of thoughts on the heels of what our fellow panelists have said, but it completely in keeping with what they've all remarked upon. And I agree with what Dr. Hammonds was saying, that I wouldn't change the narrative of this film at all, right? So we can plug in or plug out whatever scientific findings we've had in the last 20 years. But I relate to those kids, they're young kids in that video so much, and that was me. And I'm now a faculty member, I'm a laboratory bench scientist, and I study genes and I study environment and I study individual differences. And not once until I was in my faculty position designing a course where I really wanted to convey some of what we're talking about here to the students in front of me, I had never questioned the framing of the methods I was using, right? And so we can talk about or mention at the very least Francis Galton, who was a eugenicist who framed the nature-nurture debate. And unbeknownst to me, I was working within this person's framework without awareness, and working within a framework that I had inherited from my scientific upbringing and pedigree and training, which was not far away from the kids in this video, 10 years out. And I had never reflected. I had absolutely never reflected those constraints or how constraining that model was, which didn't suit me and it didn't suit the questions that I was asking, but I was happily working within that framework. And I would say that our pedagogy and our funding agencies are still saddled with that framework, right? So we still want to quantify genes for or genetic contributions to. We still have this divide between nature and nurture, or genes and environment, or experience and biology, that is sometimes explicit, but always implicitly captured in our approaches and our methods, at least from a scientific perspective. And it's not until I spend time or share space with folks who have a training and understanding of history, am I inspired to, I shouldn't say inspired, but am I reminded to question my frameworks? And I'm not sure that we do that well for our students. Coming back to what Leslie is speaking to, our pedagogy hasn't caught up certainly with the science and not the history of what we know.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And, both you and I are in the School of Public Health, and, we are teaching students who are being trained in quantitative methods and statistical methods. They're being trained to kind of think about the world in this quantified way as a way to improve health outcomes. But we don't necessarily teach them that the very methods that they're supposed to use to improve human health were developed by eugenicists for specifically eugenic purposes, right? So these are statistical methods that were designed with the very intent to be able to stratify populations in a manner that could allow resources to flow to those who are white and to take resources away from people of color and those deemed to be less valuable. And it raises important, not only methodological questions, but ethical questions. Should we continue to use these tools? And that is not a question that we have enough within our walls within the School of Public Health and within the field of public health and other fields that use these methods. And it's important to at least acknowledge, where these tools are coming from.
Yeah, I would just layer on top of that again, this film is 17 years old. And I open my teaching in classes by turning everything upside down for the students. And I thought when I started teaching at Berkeley that I would be able to do that for a couple of years, right? This was after the sequencing of the human genome, and the implicit and explicit expectations were that we would have the answers to all variability because we would have the human genome sequenced. We're incredibly special as humans. We would have hundreds of thousands of genes that's going to capture all variability. And I thought I could teach, the way I was teaching for a couple of years. And 15 or 17 years later, I'm teaching the same. I'm having the same discussions using the same tools because our student body is not there yet. And so we're not ready to let it go and move on because we're not there yet, 17 years later.
Right. So before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to remind our viewers that you can submit questions for the panel that we'll get to in the last 15 minutes. And you can submit those questions on the Facebook Live comment section or on the YouTube Live comments box. So we'll start those Q&As with the panel around 45 minutes after the hour. So Professor Francis, we'll come back to you for this next question. So you've had a really interesting career. So you started off studying genetics, as you mentioned, and you now work in the field of neuroscience and study the social determinants of health. So can you talk about the shift in relation to some of the themes in the film that we see on race and biology?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was those kids in that movie, and I grew up looking like this, a white kid in a family that identifies as Black. And I was obsessed with science, and I really wanted to understand my place in my family, but really my place in the world. And when I was a student in the 80s and late 80s and early 90s in high school, really where you went to study differences was you studied genetics, right? So I started as an undergraduate studying genetics. And I should say that my father is African-American or Black from Canada, and my mother's Indigenous First Nations, both from Nova Scotia, which have interesting racial histories. But I look like this, and I've gone through the world looking like this. So I was interested in genetics for all the same reasons those kids in that film were making their cute predictions. And at some point, I recognized that the questions that genetics was not going to answer my questions about my place, certainly in my family, but bigger than that, my place in the world. I wound up studying neurobiology in a stress lab, and the models that we were using were again framed by this nature-nurture paradigm, where we were using various inbred strains of mice to identify group differences in stress reactivity, and the implicit and explicit assumption was that those genetic differences were responsible for differences in the stress response. So I did that work as an undergraduate. And then during graduate school, I had the opportunity to really start asking different questions that were based on my own lived experiences, which I could, the longer I was on this planet, I could better articulate, which is, I really want to understand why my quality of life is so different from my sister who identifies as Black and I identify as white, or the world certainly treats me like I'm white, because I know that we have the same shared genes. I know that that at a biological level, we're no different. And so what is it that is that could be explaining my different lived experience from my sister, who I'm so very close to? So I wound up studying neuroscience and became obsessed with understanding the brain as the site of transduction of lived experience. And along the way, the experiments that we were designing and conducting really were able to allow us to understand at a very proximate molecular cellular level how different qualities of life and living and experiences using converging animal models was fundamentally influencing not the genes that you inherited or that the animals possessed or the model organisms that we were working with, but how these differences in lived experiences were fundamentally influencing how those genes were regulated or expressed. So not looking at genetic effects, but looking at epigenetic effects. So how experience is able to influence the genes that you inherit or one inherits. And it was a very liberating, as a scientist, it was incredibly liberating to have the scientific understanding of like, oh, I don't have to hunt for genes that don't exist to explain my different lived experience from my siblings, but certainly studying the stress reactivity or the stress response system and how different experiences impact that system absolutely helps me understand my path in life, which has been significantly different from my siblings. And much like that kid in the video said, it's not bad being white in this culture and society, right? My path has been that much easier based on lived experience relative to my siblings. And I can say that declaratively, and we can extract data from, again, converging model system studying various components of the stress response and demonstrate that empirically. Mm-hmm. So for some, I have questions for some of our other panelists about, again, this need to biologize lived experiences, mm-hmm. right? So we know at a very visceral lived experience level that mm-hmm. we all have different qualities of life and living. Mm-hmm. But once we can capture that biologically, all of a sudden people pay attention. And so I'm really curious about that from my fellow panelists.
Well, you anticipated my very next question, so I'm glad you raised that. So my next question was this issue of why are people so attached to biological determinism? And I think we can start with Professor Powell, and then we'll ask the other panelists as well.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Like I suggested earlier that we are meaning maker machines. You know, we need the world is, and we've always been that way. That's what culture is. That's a lot of what religion is. There's a new study out showing that they think that maybe the story of Noah's Ark had a basis in reality in the sense that, like now, with our great fires, they were having great floods. And say, oh man, the whole world is flooding. God's mad at us. You know, they might not have said the Arctic caps are melting, but there needs some way of making meaning of it. Mm-hmm. And so what we have, both in terms of early on, but certainly now, we have these radically different lives. Professor Francis just talked about it a little bit. And it's interesting when you were saying lived experience, that's what it is. We have lived experiences, but we also live in a society built upon a contradiction. As is much of Western society. So society built upon the notion of, built upon the practice of stolen land, stolen and enslaved people, and freedom. So, and there's some suggestions that white supremacy and some of the more virulent expressions of white supremacy happened after the Civil War. So part of what we're seeing is a justificatory system. We have to justify the world in which we live in, or maybe be uncomfortable, or maybe try to change it. So if I'm walking past someone who's unhoused or homeless, if I'm walking past, I'm driving in a neighborhood and all the houses are in disrepair, how do I make sense of that? And there are only a couple of options. And Kendi talks about this in some of his new book about anti-racism. And one option is that there's something wrong with those people, and therefore they're going to live in bad neighborhoods, and they're going to actually be homeless, and they're actually going to be, when you look at what happened with George Floyd, the trope that the dominant society, and people aren't coming into this on their own, the trope that the dominant society keeps coming back to is, we're all individuals. The police are good. Black people are dangerous. And so when you hear about a shooting and the Black community would get up in arms, or the white community, by and large, I'm using generalizations, would be, well, what did he do? Or what did she do? What did that person who was killed by the police do? The police don't just kill people. That doesn't make any sense. There has to be some reason. And the reason, and they said, George, there was about 10 minutes when the right really went after discrediting George Floyd. He's an ex-criminal. He has a rap sheet. He was trying to, he's not a good guy. And what you give him that is that he was a bad guy, a typical bad guy, and the police was trying to protect us from this typical bad guy. So why are we making such a big deal of it? So the biological justification is a gold star. If we can say, and if we can't have biology, let's use culture. But the point is, we have to in some way explain why one person is living a life fairly comfortable, being treated well, and another group of people are not. And so we see that again coming a lot from the political system. Something happens. I mean, it's so crazy. Think about this. President Trump argued that the reason there are fires in California was not climate change, it's that California is run by Democrats. And and therefore, the federal government should not put itself in position to extending resources to help with the fires. Uh, so it's the same kind of mindset. And I'll end just by saying this. Uh, I think one of the things we should be teaching students is the sociology of knowledge and the sociology of knowing. Because we're already halfway in the book when we just like learn something. You're always entering some kind of methodology. You're always entering some kind of framework. There's no, as we know, God's eye view. What does that really mean? So if there's no God's eye view, if there's no biological explanation, it's not simply what is the science teaching us, but why is some positions so attractive? Mm-hmm. Why do people keep organizing around it? What's that about? What's the social science about the willingness? You may remember Rodney King. When Rodney King was beat on the ground on all fours, and they showed that photo. The first trial, remember, the police were acquitted. And the theme was Rodney King was a big black man. He had to be beat. The police weren't being brutal. This was the scary big black man. I think even one of the prosecutors actually asked the question, what would be your reaction if you ran upon this guy at night in the streets? And saying really to white America, aren't you afraid of this scary black man? Of course we have to beat him. Of course we have to contain him. So the biology of racism, the biology of difference, if we can nail that down, then all the stuff that we're doing in society in terms of racial stratification begins to make sense. And in fact, it not only makes sense, those who would do otherwise, those who would invest in Black people, those who would invest in Native people, those who would invest in Latino people, they're wrong-headed. They're wasting money. This is the natural order of things. And it's not only okay, it's appropriate that whites are the dominant group. And part of that's actually talked about in the whole ideology of meritocracy. You deserve whatever you are getting.
Mm-hmm. Professor Hammond, do you have thoughts on this idea of why biological determinism has been so sticky?
You know, I agree with everything John just said. Biological determinism offers a naturalistic explanation for the social hierarchy that has prevailed in the United States since the founding of the Union, the founding of the United States. And so that's why I teach the Notes on the State of Virginia, because in it, Jefferson goes right to the heart of that. What is given by nature can't be changed. These people, in that section where he talks about Black people and the fundamental difference that makes them not the same as white people, he says that's given by nature, not by the state. And the only thing the state has to do is see they're so fundamentally different from us by nature, by God, that we're just doing the right thing by keeping them. There's no way they could ever be us, because it's given by nature that we're fundamentally and inherently different. It is that notion of inherent difference that was inscribed in law and custom and practices in the United States, and is supported by religion at certain times in parts of the 19th century, and is undone in other ways by the ascendance of certain kinds of sciences. But then we get to Du Bois, and I think I would say this is important to teach what John just talked about, along with what Du Bois's whole program was for the social sciences at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And it's sort of like, let's just stop this analysis talking about who Black people are and what Black people can do and what Black behavior is about, or what Black psychology is about, based on these observations by white experts or non-experts and just what they have to say. So one way he codified this was to say, well, if tuberculosis is a Black disease and Black people will die out because of the burden of tuberculosis in the Black community, He says, so what about the fact that if you go to Chicago and you look at the rates of tuberculosis among the immigrant populations who work in the stockyards, it's higher than the rates of tuberculosis for Black people. So is this a question of race? And if it is, how is it? And he ushered in a kind of social science not accepted in his time. And it was a great disappointment to him, but he was asking the hard questions. If it's about race, prove that it's about something you guys call race. And it couldn't be done. And it can't be done because then you have to interrogate what race is, and you have to interrogate what systemic racism is. And I think an addition to the program, a separate space, a separate episode might be to talk about as John said, the sociology of knowledge, the production of the facts that supported a notion of race as a natural category that then the state had to react to in particular ways. But of course, the state was dominated by white males throughout the time of this formation. And then went back to, Omi and Winod, who said, look, we're talking about something that's produced through a whole set of historical, social, and political processes. And that's what I think, maybe that's another piece that we could do much more about now and connect it to other aspects of the production of that kind of knowledge, which affected Native American peoples and immigrants through much of the 20th century, at least half of the 20th century, if not longer. And we could do that. We could talk more about that because I think the students for whom this film has been so useful need to have a way to think critically about this long history and and how it shaped the world that we live in today.
Thank you. Professor Lusko?
Yes.
Do you have any additional thoughts on this question of biological determinism and why it's still with us to this very day?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me chime in on this. It's just a really interesting, it's just really wonderful to hear all of these comments and these thoughts. And as a scientist, I always am a little bit hesitant about trying to get into the minds and the motivations of scientists in the past. But I would really like to pick up a thread that Evelyn had brought up earlier, that the scientist who really came up with this racialized biology, this was a really American thing. This was one of the early scientific theories that American scientists were widely recognized and praised for from the European scientific community. This is us, this is the United States scientific community owns this. And I think Evelyn's point that we need to be really careful or really mindful of the fact that these weren't bad people. Like, these were the good scientists. Like, they really thought they were doing good work. They were highly respected. And I think one of from my personal opinion, sort of my social science hat as opposed to my science hat, is that at the time, there was so much inequity happening because our country is founded on slavery as the economic base. And it's so unfair that as a scientist, if you look around and you see these inequities, you either have to say there's something fundamentally flawed with the people who have come up with this system, and being a white person, those are kind of your people, right? Or you make the case that there's a biological justification for this. And then that makes you feel less bad. Like, oh, there's a biological reason for these inequities. And so in some ways I worry that the scientists who are looking for those differences, who are justifying them, starting way back, a couple hundred years ago, and you still see echoes of this today, that it's people trying to say, the people I know, the culture I come from, they're not that bad. Like, they couldn't be that bad, because otherwise you have to say this whole system is rotten. And it's coming to terms with the whole system is rotten. And as Osagie, as you had pointed out earlier, perhaps we need to say, should we even use these analytical methods anymore, given what they were what they were designed for, I think our whole society is having this reckoning now. The whole thing is set up on this framework that is just mean and unfair, and undermining, basically demonstrating that there's no biological justification for this, really then calls into critique this whole system that's we're all a part of this, especially white people. We're so invested in this as our identity and having pride in that, and then to have to come to terms with it's just rooted in really a mean economy. I think that's where it feels like we are now, and trying to figure out how as academics and us as scientists can help move this process along and get into a better place is really poignant to be a part of this today.
Thank you.
Sagi, before we leave that, could I add two things?
Sure.
So one of the things, I think what was just said, I think is really important. One of the things you're saying, these were not bad people. I think you're right, but also think we have to move beyond that frame. So was Jefferson a bad person? He's one of the founding fathers of this country. Was he a bad person? He definitely was part of a terrible system. And he wasn't just a part of it. He was a leading figure in that system. But again, going back to what I suggested earlier in terms of Tilly, where he says we're methodological individualists, we actually want to reduce this to individual behavior. And so many times when a police shoots someone, running away from him with his hands up, part of the refrain is, I know this policeman, he's a good guy. And I think that actually detracts from what's going on, which is what you said. It's like, this is a system. And most of the people in the system are just doing what the system asks them to do. And yet it's producing terrible things. And I just want to add one other sort of complication to it. Another thing that makes it hard is when we think about our lived experiences, right? It's like, how do I know this is right? My lived experience says this, without, again, recognizing that our lived experience is not a direct experience. It's mediated through structures and systems and narratives. There's somehow, in vernacular terms, most people believe if you're not a scientist, maybe even if you are a scientist, but if you're not a scientist, the pinnacle of accurate understanding is lived experience. Every Black person I saw was a crook. That's my lived experience. It can't be wrong. That's my lived experience. I'm not a racist. I see that every day. And I know the police. I know the scientists. I know the professors. But it's actually more fundamental than even that. So I would just say not to be too distraught or disturbed by the fact that, yes, good people then and now will do terrible things and perpetuate a terrible system. And we have to figure out how to break that. And the lived experiences by themselves won't rescue us. Because, my guess is, and there's some social scientists that basically say, everybody believes what they're doing is right. That no one thinks, I'm violating my core fundamental principles. The young man who killed those people in the church was tormented a little bit, but he believed that as a protector of the white race, it was his job to kill Black people. And he even went so far as to say, I didn't dislike them. Actually spending an hour with them, I thought they were decent people. But the higher calling was to still do that. Not because I'm a bad person, but because I'm responding to the gods of white supremacy.
Right. And Professor Francis, I want to circle back to you and this question of biological determinism to see if you have any final thoughts on why it is still with us.
On the heels of this discussion, this discussion is reflecting my experiences as a scientist, as a curious person in the world, as an academic, grappling with all of these concerns myself, and working within a framework that is historical and that doesn't speak to what I want to understand about the world. And so again, I've been asking questions of the panelists, trying to understand that for myself. If I didn't know what I didn't know, and it took me 30 years to even be exposed to any of this, right? To even question my own framework or schema going through the world, just like John was saying. How do we do better? And my observation is that I have students who come through who take one of my graduate courses, and they're typically laboratory-based scientists who have never been exposed to any of the social theories or social history, or they're students who are coming from social sciences who've been afraid of biology. And this is probably similar to some of your courses, but this is the one space where we're even having these discussions. And I think back to Thomas Kuhn, who wrote Structure of Scientific Revolutions while he was on the Berkeley campus. And it was a pretty pessimistic book. And his epilogue was really about, until we have a common language and understanding.
Next week, I'm teaching it next week. It is pessimistic. Yes.
Well, it's part of what I've incorporated in my own understanding of how to, figuring this out as I go along. How do we think about this? And I think about the spaces that I hold for students. I'm just a facilitator of those discussions and share a little bit of information. But on our campuses, we don't have the pedagogy unless you happen to find a course offered by somebody who gave a talk that resonated with you. We still don't. 15 years in, I want to change my course, and I feel like I don't have that. I can't, because what happens to this space? And it's still those divides. So we are not, as academics or with our pedagogies and our institutions, we're not doing not only are we're doing a disservice to our students, but we're perpetuating what we're griping and complaining about, right? Unless we tackle those concerns. But Kuhn, followed up with it with his epilogue, really gave me some hope, talking about the power of communication and language. And we don't share space, we don't share, and we have to be willing to engage and say, I don't know, like, I'm a bench scientist. I was taught in graduate school how to pipette and make buffers, right? Like I went through a PhD program in a medical school and not once used the term race. Talked a lot about genetics, but certainly not race. Those students are still finding their way to me in classrooms. And also medical students who are not medical students, but residents, physicians who are coming through and having discussions with their fellow students who have never been exposed to the concept of social determinants of health. And this is 2020 or 2019, the last time. So what are we not doing as academics, right? So that's what I'm trying to figure out. And we might be all in our own spaces figuring this out, but we shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. And at a structural level, we have to address this. Otherwise, it'll be another 15 years. Evelyn looks the same as she did 17 years ago in that video. So otherwise, we'll have a fast forward button. But structurally, unless we collectively figure this out and share language and share discourse, I don't know another way forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So the last question for this panel, and then we'll transition to the questions from the audience. We'll focus on this statement that Professor Hammonds made in the video, where she says, "We made race, we can unmake it." And it seems like it's such a straightforward, easy process, right? And I imagine over the years, you've been asked, what does this mean? How do we do it? So I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain that a little bit further and reflect on that 17 years after the fact.
It's very funny because when the film first came out and my dad watched it for the first time, he said, "Why were you so angry at the end?" I said, "Was I angry at the end, Dad?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "But I just said we made race. Black people didn't make race. And why are you saying this?" So he was angry about what I said. It was very interesting. So the film, for me, I'm just a little coda. It's personal because there are pictures of me when I was 9 years old looking at Life magazine and these kinds of things. And so, and contrary to what Darlene said, no, I don't feel like I look like I did at that age and all of that. But I was actually, I thought it was a throwaway line to say we made it, we can unmake it. I put myself in the community of scientists, social scientists, analysts. That's the we I was understood, though I was not explicit about that. And also we the people, that in the United States structured by a racial hierarchy, that we can unmake this racial hierarchy. We can stop it from being a way in which we distribute resources or opportunities, or all the things that I think I look back as a historian to what the expectation was. And the moment that I resonate most toward right now is the moment of Reconstruction. The African Americans have been newly freed. And it's a moment when the war barely over and then the war's over. When we have the period of Reconstruction, it goes into the 1870s, late 1870s. And the federal government realized that they had to take care of these people because they had no food, they had no homes, they had no health care, nothing. At the time that that happened, there was also raging epidemics of smallpox and other diseases that were actually under control, in smallpox in particular. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was the first national effort to provide adequate health care to African American populations. And the African American leaders who were involved in that effort wrote to the government and said, you have to do this because it's a right of citizenship. And we're not citizens. So you need to do this. And of course, the history shows that the federal government finally retreated. There was a huge fight. You can read all the history if you want. And the southern states won. And we entered by 1900 into the period of Jim Crow, of disenfranchisement from the body politic. And science played a role in that. And the notion of fundamental difference was actually amplified in yet another way. If these people are biologically deficient in some ways, then we shouldn't extend full rights to them as people. My interest is in trying to bridge for students that step from the scientists who provided, who are living in their time, but not only that, but who wanted to provide a naturalistic explanation for what was a draconian set of social policies, and not just draconian, horrific, because people died. And so there's no way that I could have said all of that in that moment. So I just did this throwaway line and said, we made it, we can unmake it. But we can unmake it. Mm-hmm. We can't ensure that scientific explanations of human variation do not serve to support national policies to disenfranchise people who are marked as different or other, and that their otherness and their difference is the root cause of the situations that they face. Like I said, I couldn't have said all of that. But one of the great things about the film over this time is literally a year and a half ago, I was walking across Harvard campus, going somewhere else, and a student said, I just loved your lecture today. And I said, I didn't lecture today. Oh, the film. And I said, oh, okay. So, but what did you mean by the unmaking? And I said, I meant we can think ourselves to a different place. We can think about the long, terrible history of the use of race as naturalistic, biological, to another place of understanding real social determinants of health and biological differences. And of course, another thing I forgot to say is human variation is real. Variation within a species is real. It's real. Of course, we're going to be different. It doesn't mean that difference is deficit. Science has come in many ways, and this is a broad generalization, and I'm going to get killed for it. But science, some sciences have stood on the side of difference as deficit, but difference is difference. In other species, difference is difference. And so I think that it's a moment where we can, if we study hard our history, if we understand our social science, if we really, as Darlene said, Darlene didn't hear about any of this stuff for a very long time, that scientists and humanists and social scientists and artists and regular people know more about this. We can think ourselves out of the structures that we, in fact, created. Of course, you can't do that in a film in the last 5 minutes. So I did what I could, and I was happy that they sent me back my Life magazine book, Time Life magazine book, where I was sitting as a kid when I was 9 years old, to close the circle. But that's where I was coming from. And I probably should write this because I get asked all the time. But it's really meaningful to me. And perhaps ending with a sort of shorthand like that is probably not the best thing to do today.
Well, thank you for that. So we have about a little less than 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So I'm going to read, hopefully try to get through a few of these questions. This first question I think is really useful for this panel since we're all academics. So the question is, what or who are the obstacles today to correcting our shared understanding of race in the academy?
Wow.
We could have an entire panel on this, a separate hour-long panel on this, I think. But if folks,
Leslie is ready to do that one.
Yeah, if folks have quick responses, I think it'll be useful for folks to have some insights on what's happening here in academia and these topics.
So one quick response from me is as you know, as a biologist, is seeing that we have these silos in the academy. That you're a social scientist, you're a biological scientist, you study the humanities. You know that there's these silos, and we have our students take classes in silos, and there's very few opportunities to really explore the space between the silos. But when you talk about human biology and human biological variation, it exists smack in the middle of the humanities, the social sciences, and the biological sciences. And until we all get, everybody on campus, and not just those of us who are listening to this webinar or who are part of this, that everybody gets comfortable with being in the space in between, I think it will be very difficult to get over the hurdle.
And are there obstacles outside the academy that we should also flag and be mindful of?
Well, I think some of the issues outside of the academy that I think, which you may know about, Osage, today, a number of social scientists and scientists penned a letter to that was published in Science Magazine today that asked the NIH and other leading scientific organizations to really do a deep dive and study of the continuing use of categories of race in science. And it's time to do that interrogation. And I think, I don't know if you know the number, but there are a number of really, many people signed on to that. That it's time to do that. It's a moment of reckoning, so it's time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Do others have thoughts on obstacles inside or outside the academy?
I have a couple. One, we don't have agreement. So part of the question in terms of, we do speak different languages. We have different motivations. We have different orientations. We're in a fight. First of all, the meaning of race and racism has constantly shifted. And that's partially the work of Michael Omi and Howard Wane. So it's not one thing. It was Malcolm X that says, race and racism is like a Cadillac. You get a new one every year. So we're not talking about one thing. We're talking about, and so think about this. We had our first Black president, and then we get Donald Trump. So there's this constant back and forth. And when you talk about a project, which we have a little bit, it's serving some people. Steve Martin makes two observations. One, he says, it's not just a question of conflict of interest. We're talking about conflict of being. We're talking about ontological questions, because people inhabit race in such a way that, especially white people, not all white people, but many white people, that's where they get their sense of being from. So when the Proud Boys say, you will not replace us, they're talking about not just not losing my job, they're talking about losing their sense of who they are. And they're talking about, so literally you have from the far right now this constant talk about genocide to white people, and that they have to fight back. Uh, and I have to get this in. So Steve says, playing off of Marx, Marx makes the observation that marriages is a relationship between two men mediated through a woman. And he says race or whiteness is a relationship between white people mediated through people of color, particularly blacks. That this is about largely about reconstructing a white identity. And I would say in part, it's hard for us to imagine a different white identity. So what we have is that we have this white identity, or like the Proud Boys, we have genocide. So what would a different role and identity and being, ontological being for white people be? And to me, that's not so much a scientific question as a potentially spiritual and even religious question. And I'll just end by saying religion, and Dr. Hammond talked about this a little bit, religion plays a huge role. There are times when the science wasn't on the side of racism that people turned very much to religion. Yes. And so what we see now is that religion, if science is in the way, for a lot of people, they just reject it. You know, this is deeper than science. So anyway, so those are some of the barriers.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. And on that note, we are coming up on the hour, so we have to end the conversation here. So I want to thank all the panelists for joining us and for their excellent thoughts. And for the audience, I want to remind you that we have 2 more video screenings coming up for that examine the following to our last 2 episodes of the documentary. Episode 2 will be September 25th from 1 to 3 o'clock Pacific time, and episode 3 will be October 9th from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. Pacific time. So once again, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.